Okay, I'm not going to be too long. Thank you all very much for coming out to our very first History Under the Stars lecture of this spring and summer season for 2026. My name is Paul. I'm the director of Delaware County Historical Society. Of course, most of you know that. Feel free to hang out and just wait till the very end of the presentation for any questions or comments that you have for Mr. Wagner. And of course, Mr. Richard Wagner here will be our first presenter this evening. He is going to be doing a presentation on colonial brewing technology, specifically, as I understand, from the 18th century, going back to the colonial times. And if you are interested in his subjects, he has a wonderful book for sale. You can come talk to him after the lecture for a copy. I think he's charging $20 for a copy. Really cool book about Philadelphia brewing history. So again, I now turn it over to Mr. Richard Wagner. Thank you.
Thank you. So most of my research in brewing in Pennsylvania has concentrated on Pennsylvania as an English colony. But of course, there was the Swedes and the Dutch here before that, so I threw in a couple of those things. I think that's a pretty interesting beer pitcher, like a little barrel made out of wood with staves and everything, or with hoops. So, I mean, it goes way back. Philadelphia, I always think of Philadelphia with Penn coming in 1682 to lay out the city. So somebody gave me this a title, and I got the book about agriculture in the United States that goes back to the beginning. And this image that we have of William Penn disembarking to welcome and finding nothing in where Philadelphia was. There were orchards, there was fields planted, there was a lot of stuff going that I never really thought about. And of course, Chester was his first stop. Maybe not his first stop, but he stopped in Chester before he went to Philadelphia back then. And he renamed the town of Upland to Chester in honor of the guy that was the mayor or something that was from that section of England. So anyway. So brewing is very important, and Penn and later the founders knew that it promoted agriculture, it generated tax revenue, and it promoted a temperate society. Somebody that wasn't swilling rum all day. You could swill beer all day and not be in the same shape, but that's neither here nor there. I think it's interesting when you talk about the alternative ingredients. Like, we think of the beer today as malt, hops, water, malt, hops, and yeast. They had all kinds of other things they made drinks out of. And the spruce tree, actually, when you made spruce beer, a lot of ship captains wanted spruce beer because it had citrus in it, so they prevented scurvy. The Swedes made tea from the sassafras, beer and brandy from the persimmon. They also brewed small beer from Indian corn. The brewing was done by the women, as in Sweden and in other parts of Europe, and the Dutch had several breweries in the settlement about the year 1662. The Dutch bestowed universal qualities upon beer, giving it an almost sacred status, and competition over its production was seen as healthy and worth supporting. Farmers breakfasted on beer and eggs, and those with stronger stomachs dined on concoctions of eggs, sugar, warm beer, and ample amounts of brandy wine, just to set yourself up for the day, And there's just some of the sugar-bearing fruits and so forth that could be used in conjunction with or in lieu of grain. I thought this was interesting, that the Indians actually had a form of beer, and they would set aside the dark kernels of the corn, and then they would make beer with that, and they'd make tortillas out of the lighter colored ones. And here they're talking about New Jersey. They brew a good drink from water and molasses at 2 shillings per barrel, like 8-shilling beer in England. The same writer asks that a brewer be sent over from England, there being a man ready to put up a malt house. Still another writer extols the virtue of the land along the Delaware River as suitable for raising barley, wheat, and hops, and gives the opinion that there was a fine opportunity for brewing beer and exporting it to the islands where the English were earning a great deal of money by importing beer. And you can see here early, this is 20 years before it was an English colony, or before Penn came. They're encouraging farmers to plant barley. So the first crop of barley, 1683 in Pennsylvania. Here is very good rye, also barley of 2 sorts, as winter and summer, and also oats and 3 sorts of Indian corn. So a lot of things. Barley is valuable for the brewer because it has an excess of enzymes that are used in the mashing process. And these enzymes convert the starch in the grain to sugar. Well, when you're making cider or some of these other beverages, the fruit or the raw ingredients have sugar in them, so you don't have to go through this elaborate process to convert starch to sugar and so forth. But you could combine barley that had this extra amount of enzymes, and you could combine that with other grains such as oats, which was a popular grain used in Pennsylvania breweries during this time period. So the first thing you have to do to make the barley suitable for the brewer is to malt it. And so by malting the barley, you put it into a steep tank, and you let it soak for overnight or for some prescribed amount of time. Then you drain the water off. You can see, like most seeds, if you've ever done any kind of experiments, they give off gases when they're sprouting and so forth. And then what they would do is after they drain the water off, then they would spread the wet barley on the growing floor. And this is where the sprouts, the barley kernels would sprout. And so these men are turning it to keep it from going into an unwieldy mass of sprouts, so that you could take care of it. So this is at Guinness, a modern in this century or last century. And there you can see the sprouts. When the sprout gets about 1.5 times the length of the grain of the kernel, then they stop the sprouting process and then they put it into a kiln. They get rid of the sprouts and they put it into a kiln, and then this dries it out. So aside from the fact that the brewer, it doesn't use the raw barley for the most part, by malting it, it stabilized the grain for storage. You got rid of a lot of the moisture and so forth that was in the grain that would create problems if you just had it in a silo. So this is at one of the craft breweries today. I think they just went out of business, the Rogue Brewery out in Oregon. And some of these brewers have actually started malting their own grain. And right out in this neck of the woods, you've got Deer Creek. I think that's Chester County, not Delaware County. But there's also a new craft malting business in Huntington Valley as well. But here you can see there's the malting floor. That would be analogous to what I just showed you from the Guinness Brewery. There's the steep tank. There's the kiln. And then this is a patent for an early kiln for drying the malt. And that's 1892. Oh, the patent was from 1635. Yeah, I'm emphasizing how far back some of this stuff goes. When I do my colonial brewing demonstration, people would invariably ask me about, doesn't the smoke affect the taste of the barley? And that was an issue at a certain point. But as you can see here, this is designed to eliminate that problem, and it's 1635. So people were always trying to improve the quality of the raw materials. This is just some back and forth between one of the most well-known brewers in Philadelphia, someone's asking him, how do you build a malt house? How do you build your kiln? How do you build, what, and asking him picking his brain, as it were, and asking him, what's your experience with doing this? So how thick is it generally kept on the floor? How often is it turned? He's answering. It's kind of interesting. "17-foot square kiln. We lay about 2/4, probably I don't know if that's 1/4 of a bushel, or it's got to be more than that, and use about 2 hours drying. For a full brown malt, for pale, we lay it on 6/4, which takes 24 hours drying. So if the higher the temperature, or the longer you keep the barley in the kiln, that's what's affecting the kind of malt that you end up with. I'll get to that picture in a second. This is a late 19th century innovation, the dumping floor. So you can see how a kiln house would be set up with all the various floors here. And then this enabled the guy to, after it had been on this floor for a certain length of time, then it eliminated a lot of manual operations. But here you go. There you have the pale malt, and by making the malt pale, you haven't heated it up to a great extent. You're just drying it out, so it doesn't affect the enzymes that are in the kernels. When you make the caramel malt, you're taking the temperature up to a higher level, and so some of the starch actually begins to caramelize and turn to sugar in the kernels. And of course, that's not fermentable. But for the brewer, that's what can give beer a sweetness and also color. And then you have the black patent malt that's taken to the highest temperature, and that's virtually no good for doing any starch to sugar conversion. It's basically for flavor and color.
Is that port or like porter beer or Guinness?
Well, again, to make Guinness, you would still need, the majority of your grain bill would have to be pale malt to get any of this conversion, but then a small amount, like 12%, 8%, that would 8% of that stuff would give you a porter. So some English malt hands from the 19th century. And then the other ingredient, of course, is hops. I always called it a hop vine. I found out from some botanists that it's called a hop bine because it's not a climbing vine like ivy. It wraps itself around things. Like I have hops in my garden, and if you stand there long enough in July, they're liable to start wrapping themselves up on your legs. But that's how much they grow, 6 inches in a day. This is up in Mumford, New York, in Genesee Village, and they have a hop garden, and then that's the kiln house. That's where they kiln the hops. And there you can see that above you would have a slatted floor. They would put a horsehair mat down, and then they would spread the malt. Well, it could be malt or hops, but they would spread the hops on that, and then the fire down below to provide the heat. And again, you don't want to cook these things because the hops have a lot of volatile oils in them that don't do well in a hot environment like that. So you're just trying to dry out the hops so that you can store them. So this is a familiar site, and Kent, England, is basically where we get all our hops from originally. That was the primary source of hops back in the day. And you can see these vents up there. You can see it says they follow the wind. So I don't know what that's all about. Just to keep the flow of air at the maximum, I guess. I don't know. But this is a side view or a drawing of what that would have looked like. So here you got the bales of green hops coming in, the hops drying on the floor, And then you can see hair cloth, the plenum chamber, the heat chamber, the hot air rising, and so forth. So then the next step, after you make the malt, then the brewer has to mill the malt. And this is from the Newland Mill over in Glen Mills. And I did my Colonial Brewing demonstration for them over the years. And the one year we milled two 50-pound bags of malt using their mill. And it was interesting because, and that's Tony Shahan, he knows all about milling and so forth. And he told me he had talked to people that said the only time you could mill the barley was when you were ready to clean the stones, because the enzymes in the barley, if you left them on the stone and then tried to do corn, it would like turn the corn rancid. Those enzymes would act on the corn in a way you didn't want. So there's the milled malt. This is the Bacon Brew House at Pensbury Manor. I brewed the first batch of beer there in 1990-91. It was really a lot of fun. It was an incredible experience. And there's my homebrew partner and my son helped me out. And there's the mash tun, the receiving tub, and Dan there, he's holding a baler for transferring liquids. So that's a pretty good representation of what an early, not primitive, but an early low-tech, I guess you'd call it, little brew house. And so the Twin Gables building there was Anthony Morris's brewery right around the waterfront and Walnut Street in Philadelphia. And so I'm saying that his brewery could have looked something like that. And he started in 1687. And then what I really enjoy about the research is Accessible Archives has the Pennsylvania Gazette and some other early papers. And now, since then, I think the Free Library has stuff online, and other sites have similar things with really old newspapers. But this was when he was ready to rent that brewery out, and you can see exactly what was inside, because if you're reading the newspaper just like you would today, well, I need this, or I don't need that, or this isn't big enough, or this is exactly what I want. So I thought that was pretty cool, because I've always tried to, how can I put you in situ, as it were? how can we go and see Anthony Morris's brewery? So he built a second brewery at Dock and Pear Street, which is right near the steps that go up to Society Hill Towers. So where that theater is, where Dock Street curves around, where there's a theater there, that's where this brewery was. Is that the Ritz? Okay.
Now it's the Film Society.
Okay. What did I do? I don't know if you're familiar with Diderot. Frenchman thought the world was coming to an end, so he better make a book about all of human technology. As what?
It's 2 books.
2 books. Okay, well, I only used the one because it had the breweries in it. But this shows you what it could have looked like, what Morris's brewery could have looked like at Dock and Pear Street. I like that, when you talk about horsepower, that's what was turning things. And in some cases slaves, and in some cases indigenous servants of all kinds. But it was man, like when I look at these tax records, it says power for a brewery. It'll, when they list the information, it says power by man and horse. So this is a picture of a pretty sophisticated London brewery from about the 1700s. And you can see there's the kettle. Most of you, if you've ever taken a brewery tour, that's the most exciting part, is watching the stuff steam and boil and cook. But at the end of the boil, they would have what the brewer called a knockout, and it was like they would knock out the plug from the bottom of the kettle, and then it would come down a ramp into a cool ship, a large surface cooler, to bring the temperature down from boiling all the way cool so that you could put yeast into it and ferment the beer. So I don't know if anybody wants to go through the gory details, but I have them all labeled here. Up top, you have these two. A back is a tub or a tank, something. I don't know why it's called a back, whether it holds things back, I don't know. But you have the LB and the CB. The liquor back would be your cold liquor tank. The copper back would be your hot liquor tank. So you heat water in the kettle, then you could send it back up to the copper back. You could, if you were going to come in to brew, you'd fill the cold liquor tank the day before, and then when you came in the morning, you'd put it in the copper and then heat it up. So after the boil, before the boil, you have the MT, the mash tub. That's where you put the milled malt, and you have to have the water at a precise temperature, around 170 degrees or so. After you mix it with the malt, it comes down to about 150 some, and that's the temperature at which the enzymes in the malt convert the starch to sugar. So the mash tub or mash tun is there, and then below that is the underback or the receiving tub, and then that would be for this sweet liquid that is made from the malt, which the brewer calls wort. So after you've collected that in the underback, then you could pump that up to the copper where it gets boiled. During the boil, the hops are added for flavoring and for bitterness. And then the JB, the jackback, or the hop jack, when they're ready to, when they knock out, the hot boiling liquid goes through. That's got a sieve in it that holds the hops back, and then the wort goes in, like in that other drawing. The wort would go down a trough into this large surface cooler or cool ship. And then you have the working tub. The working tun is the big one over there on the right. That would be where the fermentation takes place. And then you have kegs where you would put the beer after it's finished fermenting. I read about these brewers. They're very conservative. Once they get a system down, they don't want any changes. And the one kid had heard about the thermometer, and he had to sneak around with his thermometer when his dad wasn't looking to put the thing in to see what the temperature was. And between the thermometer and the hydrometer, which measures the density of liquids, those two things is really what turned the art and mystery of brewing into the science and technology of brewing, because now you could see what you were getting from your material. You could see, well, maybe if I drop the temperature down, maybe I'll get a better extraction, more sugar from my malt, or maybe if I, do this or that. And so that it quantified things. And then Perot's Brewery this is the first stationary steam engine in America, which is pretty cool. Now that's not the colonial period, but it's 1819. So this is Dawson's Brewery. This would be at the corner of 11th and Filbert, northwest corner of 11th and Filbert Street. Ellison Perot and his brother were involved in the West Indies trade. He sent his 15-year-old son, Francis, to the bank to make a deposit. On his way, Francis was attracted by some work he saw as he passed Dawson's brewery. Mr. Dawson noticed him and remarked, "Thee is a good strong-looking lad. What is thy name?" And upon being told, he replied, "Thee would make a good brewer." Mr. Dawson invited him to look through the building, and upon his return, Francis told his father he wished to become a brewer. He was apprenticed to Thomas Morris for 6 years, having to pay his employer a fee of $1,000 for the privilege, and the first 2 years he spent in the malt house and 1 year as a miller. Each day, Francis carried 90 bushels of malt on his back to the third floor where it was milled, then carry it 1 story higher. For 1 year, he was in the cellar, after which he was given charge of the brewing. 3 mornings a week, he had to get up at 1 o'clock in the morning, and after his apprenticeship, he took to the malt house of Samuel Downing at Downingtown for 1 winter. In 1818, he purchased Snowden's Brewery and Malt House on the south side of Vine between 3rd and 4th Street in Philadelphia, and about a year afterward, he took his brother into partnership, William S. Perot. In 1823, he married Thomas Morris's daughter, Elizabeth. So this makes Perot connected to Anthony Morris, which was like only the third brewer in the city from 1687, and so from thereafter, Perot and the Perot Company, and he ended up just becoming a maltster. But he said we're the oldest business house in America because it went back to 1687 with his father-in-law, distant father-in-law. There's old Francis and his brewery and malt house. So there's actually some of these day books at the Historical Society of Pennsylvania. This is what I extracted from the notes that I could read of how he's making his beer, how much grain he's using, what he's getting, what kind of beer he's making, and so forth. So of course the primary ingredient is water, and invariably, people always ask, well, was the water safe to drink? And yes, there was water that was safe to drink. There was also water that was polluted. But when you made beer, you boiled water. So if there were any microbes, you had a good chance of killing them off and having a beverage. Kind of like when you make tea also, I think. So this is up back at Mumsford. They have this 5-barrel brew house in a building that it was an old brewery building in Rochester, and they took it apart and put it back together at Mumsford, Genesee Village. And so they do this as a 2-day process. So here he is adding the milled malt to the mash tun. And you notice there's no hoses. They have troughs. So they have wooden troughs. So there they are. That's the kettle, or the copper, as it was called. And he's sending hot liquor, hot water, to the mash tun. That's called striking the mash. So here's on my system, this is my wife stirring the mash. That's our mash rake. So you want to make sure that the grain gets equally mixed with the water so you get the maximum extraction and the maximum work out of your enzymes. And there's an early advance, someone's patented device for taking away some of the manpower, having a machine to do the mixing for you. During the mash rest, you can see I put the lid on the mash tub to keep it hot. During the mash rest, the natural enzymes convert starch in the grain to sugar. And then in the sparge, after the rest, you then take really hot water, and this sort of arrests the mashing process, this conversion of starch to sugar, and you're rinsing the grains. You're trying to get as much sugar that's still in the particles of in the grain and so forth, because the mash tub basically is a strainer. So when you start to strain the wort from the mash, you've rinsed it. You've got this really hot water that gets the last bit of sweetness, the last bit of sugar you can get. And that's my receiving tub, or my receiving tun, and that's the drip of the wort coming down from my mash tub. So that's me sending the wort to the copper. I don't have a trough, I have my baler. So I bale the hot liquid from that receiving tub and then put it in the copper, just the same way as I described how it would be done in that London brewhouse drawing. And then you boil. and you boil. And this is another one of the things, depending on the style of beer you're making. Sometimes you want to boil it longer to get rid of some of the water and to concentrate the sugary wort. Sometimes you know, that's all part of the art and mystery of brewing. You know, when you're making this kind of beer, you want a thin mash. You make this kind of beer, you make a thick mash. You know, and so. And this is where the hops are added. So during the boil, hops are usually added at the beginning of the boil, in the mid part of the boil, and at the end of the boil. And so I can't imagine what this room must have been like with, you know, a couple thousand gallons of wort coming down that coming down the flume there. And now some of these craft brewers are getting into the act with cool ships. And not only that, but the monks in Belgium and Holland, like, they used to ferment the beer using airborne yeast. So that's what they are doing at Allagash. This is next to a pine forest. And they got the windows open, and they keep those windows open all night. After they send the beer into this surface cooler, they're relying on the yeast from the air to settle on the wort and start a fermentation, a wild fermentation, if you will. So that's my cool ship. No thousands of gallons here, but I'm making about a barrel or a half barrel when I do my demonstration, and that's the hop jack or the hop back that I'm pouring the wort into, and by having that strainer there, that captures the hop leaves, and then it also, those hops then act to filter the wort to make it a nice clear wort. And this is the reason I went to Mumford was to see their cool ship. I had never seen anybody with a cool ship before. You can see this is in 3 different surface coolers, one higher, lower, and lower. So I don't know, I would not want it to be stirring that stuff when it's cooling down like that, because you're opening your chance up for infection. But anyway, it cools down to a certain level. They pull the plug on the top one, goes into the second one, cools a little bit more, pull the plug on that one, it goes into the third one to cool even more. So these are the working tubs or the fermenters that they have in the floor below. So there you can see a trough is bringing this wort from the cool ship down into the fermenters. And there's the cooled wort at my cool ship. I pull the plug and it goes right into the fermenter. And then, of course, this is the food waste program at Genesee Village. So I showed, we took the tour and everything, and this just shows you what the yeast looks like. And so brewers would frequently sell yeast to housewives, because you end up with more yeast than you start with because you're feeding yeast sugar. So the population of these microbes expands greatly. I don't know. I think it's like 8 or 10 times as much as you put into the fermenter. You get that 8 or 10 times more yeast out of it, something like that. So there I am pitching the yeast. They call it pitching the yeast. And back in these days, they didn't know if yeast was an animal, mineral, or vegetable. And the English brewers, when they would pitch the yeast, they would say, they called it God is good. And it was like a prayer, like, make some beer, make some beer. So during this fermentation process, the yeast is eating the sugar. This is where all the heavy lifting occurs, if you will. The yeast are eating up all this sugar that you made for them from the starchy grain, and then when they expel their byproducts, they exhale CO2, which is the foam, and they exhale alcohol. That's the beer. So this is one of the more interesting things I saw at Mumford. That's a hose. And if you can imagine taking a leather belt and wrapping it around into a cylinder and then putting rivets in it That's how they made the hose at Genesee Village. So that hose connects with those working tubs of the primary fermenters, and then they have the casks for aging the beer down below in the cellar. And this is another drawing from Diderot. A more substantial brewery filling up all the casks. That's an early bottle. Even during the colonial period, they had bottles, and they had wine bottles, they had beer bottles, and a lot of the ads you'll see, we'll bottle so much beer for so much amount, but you have to bring the bottles, or if I have to supply the corks and the bottles, then it's this much, And that's the brewer's dray. It's a low wagon. They can just roll the kegs on and then take them to the tavern, and they would have some kind of a ladder to go down into the cellar. The thing that fascinates me is some of these casks that they were delivering to the taverns held like 3 barrels of beer, and a barrel's 31 gallons. So they're talking about casks that hold 100 gallons of beer. This is in Dayton, Ohio, and this is so cool. I've wanted to see this, and they actually sell the beer they make here. I think they have a modern system behind the scenes, but they also make beer using the tubs and using the equipment the same way it would have been done. I think they call this an 1840 brew house. So there's the mash tub up top, copper above that, goes into the receiving tub below, and then these would be the aging tanks. This was a painting at the Indian King Tavern in Haddonfield. Philadelphia brewed bottled beer sold by Timothy Matlack at his store in 4th Street, a few doors below Market. 6 shillings per dozen, exclusive of the bottles, which to suit the buyer they may either exchange for others or pay for. Tavern keepers who live at a distance and masters of vessels may have it wired and packed free of cost, and it will be stamped on the cork with ink. And so he went bankrupt, and this is the inventory to see, how much money they, the creditors that came in, they wanted to see how much he was worth. This is the stuff, when I find something like this in the stacks, in the archives, I'm excited. This is just so incredible. Again, this takes us inside his brewery, essentially. And it also, there you just see, like, he's got kegs with steel hoops. He's got iron hoops. He's got kegs that have hoops made of wood. And then they talk about a mash tun about half worn, like some guy kicking tires at the used car lot. It's about half worn. So 3 old rum hogsheads. A hogshead's about 1.5 barrels. 3 tubs, iron bound, yeast tubs with iron handles. Copper yeast ladle with iron handle. Horse pumps with an iron crank and 1 brass chamber and 1 hand pump with an iron handle. 2 mashing oars. And you can see he has a copper still. A lot of the brewers also did distilling because, and I don't pretend to know anything about distilling, but basically they make a form of beer. They don't call it beer, but they make something with a 5% alcohol, and then during the distillation process, you're eliminating water and concentrating the alcohol. So, and in fact, that was one of the things you could do after a beer went bad. You could distill it and then have the alcohol. I don't know if that was safe to drink or not, but you would have alcohol that could be used for a variety of other uses. So this is all the sizes. So I said a hogshead. I never remember these, but a hogshead, I said it was about 1.5 barrels. So it's also interesting to note, this is London, 1697. A barrel of beer is 36 gallons. A barrel of ale is 32 gallons. So, and I don't think that the United States had their commission or whatever it is of weights and measures until like the mid 19th century. But I'm pretty sure we were using the English system. But it's also interesting that like the beer barrels, they don't look like most of these places that have decorative barrels out, they're all old wine barrels. But you can see a beer barrel has a different shape to it. So, and then I have a barrel of fun, and I challenge people at my events to put a barrel together. So there's a bunch of kids. I thought this always fascinates me. These kids, they were like a committee. Like there was 3 of them. And the one's going, well, I think we should do this. And then the other 2 were talking about, well, Bill, I don't think that's, I think we have a better idea. And it was so cool to watch them, and they, no fist fights, no, So anyway, that's the thing taken apart. So I numbered all the staves so you could put it back in the exact order, but this was a modern 1906 barrel. So it was all machine made, so they were pretty standard staves, not like not like one that was made as a single piece. And there you can see that's the trick. That's how you do it. Start with 3, like a little tripod. You need I cheat with the elastic, I realize that, but you start with 3 and that gets you started, and then you just put the other staves in and away you go. So that's 1 barrel, that's a 1/2 barrel, and that's 1/4 barrel. Here's an ad for spruce beer. Again, prices don't mean anything other than being able to see how much things cost relative to other things for whatever the shillings were worth at that time. So a barrel of stouts, 36 shillings. Strong or double ale is 30 shillings. Midland beer is 9 shillings, and small beer is 4 shillings, 6 pence. And here, I've never heard of Welsh ale before, but I'm assuming this guy was from Wales, and he was making beer at his tavern, so he called it Welsh ale. The other thing that's interesting here is they call it a nip or a 1/2 pint. So if you remember, in the old days, Rolling Rock had those 7-ounce pony bottles, and that was called, it had a little nip was part of the writing on the label. So a nip is a 1/2 pint. Like theirs was not a 1/2. It was not 8 ounce. It was 7 ounce. But still, that was an old term that was used for a long time. And then another thing, just showing the kinds of beer. Basically, if you go back, if you picture that London brew house, if you get the first mash, send that to the cool ship. Then you've got water heating up in the copper. You send more water down to the mash tun. You add 15% more malt, and you get a second runnings. You get a second mash out of that. That would be your Midland beer. And then you send that to the cool, after that's boiled, you send that to the cool ship, and then you then you have the last runnings, the final runnings would be your small beer, which is going to be anywhere from 1 to 3% alcohol, and that's what they would probably add molasses to beef it up a little bit. But that, in other words, that was the cheapest beer. So you were paying for the alcohol or the ingredients. The stronger beer cost more to make. So, and that's it. So, if if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them. And other than that, thanks for coming. All right. Yes.
In that patent drawing for the malt kiln, it called for using sea coal turf.
Yes.
What is that?
I looked that up. I think that's kind of like it's not, the Irish burned sod. It's something like that, but it forms in the sea, in the ocean. So I don't know what sea coal is. Maybe it's stuff that fell off of ships, or I don't know. I'm sorry. Okay. Yes.
You mentioned there at the end first, second, and third words, but in the middle of your talk, when you were talking about your own brewing process, you use sparging. Has anybody studied the history of sparging and when that started? When it became popular?
I don't know about that. I put in that slide, I said it's Latin for sprinkle, and when you looked at me sparging, I'm just dumping it in, so it's not as fine-tuned as it is like in a modern brewery. They have an arm with it's like a sprinkler arm to do the final the sparge. But, yeah, I don't know why. I think it's basically just to get the last bit of everything you can.
For sure, yeah, but historically they were doing first, second, and third words as you described there at the end. Which would take a whole lot more time, but then you get 3 different beers out of it.
Yes,
Right?
yes.
So at some point, this idea of efficiency happened, I guess.
Well, you could still sparge, and even before instruments, you could taste how sweet it was when it was coming out of the mash, But you could tell, like, okay, that's enough water. Don't add any more water. I don't know. Like most things I said, these guys were real conservative. They'd get a method, and they wouldn't want to change anything. So, 2 buckets of yeast, or do this for this long. You got to remember, like some of these guys, there weren't clocks when they were doing this. I always say, I use the movement of the sun in the sky as my timepiece when I'm doing my thing. But I can't say anything about the sparge. No. Yes.
It seems like at times there's a lot involved in doing this process, and I'm wondering if there's any kinds of concerns about bacteria entering into this, or what kinds of things spoil the process and turn the beer in the beer making process to crap.
Well, the enemies of beer are light, temp, and heat, and oxygen. So any of those things that were entered into the process, like all the modern methods have tried to eliminate any chance of fouling the beer. What they would do to clean things, they would scald things. So they'd use boiling water. So that was one way to eliminate. They didn't know about germs either, but by scalding something, that made it, you scrubbed it good, but then you scalded it, and that was how they tried to prevent the spoilage. The other main thing is the temperature. Like once you tap the keg, you have to finish it, because you're letting air in through the bunghole after a while. So you've got the air with its host of microbes floating around, and that's so yeah. You didn't have a keg, like there were family-sized kegs like that Sixtel I had that holds 5 gallons of beer. So
Was there any way in those days to test whether or not the beer was getting foul, or did you just get sick on it?
You just the taste. Some of the recipes they talked about, the early porter was actually like 3 threads. They called it 3 threads. So it was equal parts stale beer, fresh beer, and something else. The answer to everything, like in modern day, is add sugar to it. So you could add sugar. That's another reason why they added spices to the beer, was to give it some flavor if it had an offensive flavor. And the other thing was our palates are probably a lot different than people's palates were back in those days. So you expected beer to be kind of sour. You expected beer to be, you know. And of course, I didn't go into it, but there was a lot of whiskey and back in those days it was mostly rum, but rum and wine and cider, mostly cider. That was the poor man's beverage because it was easy to make, and that's, you know, they had a lot of orchards.
When was the height of brewing in Philly?
Right now. In 1888, there was probably 93 breweries in Philadelphia. So if it's the number,
How many are there today?
I couldn't tell you. There's so many new ones, I can't keep track. But the 93 breweries. Schmitz went out of business in 1987. They made more beer in a year than all 93 of those breweries could make. So that another heyday would be, you know, Schmitz was like the 12th largest brewer in the country. They owned a brewery in Norristown, one in Philadelphia and one in Cleveland. So if you want to, depends on what you're calling the heyday. You know, that was the pinnacle of Philadelphia brewing. That's as far as they could take it before Schmitz closed. And when they closed in 1987, it was the first time in over 300 years there were no breweries in the city. Back then, like if you were making 2,000 barrels a year, that was probably a pretty big operation.
What drove them out? They just didn't market it correctly? I mean, they must have done something right around that time.
You mean Schmitz? Yeah. It was a time when television advertising was changing things dramatically. Like everybody watched Monday Night Football, and whoever was advertising Monday Night Football, you know, like it ended up, it was Anheuser-Busch was number one, Miller was number two, and Coors was number three. So they called them the big three. There was others too, but you know, Pabst was big. Schlitz was bigger than Anheuser-Busch during a significant portion of time. But really, it was the television advertising and the mergers that were happening in a lot of other industries as well. Okay. Well, that's it. Thanks again for coming. Have a beer.
Thank you, Rich. Appreciate the presentation.
Thank you.
Just to let you all know, our next presentation is a week from tonight. It's